The narrative concerning the history of slavery in America is usually presented as pretty straightforward. Southern states built an economy based on enslaved African people harvesting tobacco and cotton. Northern states opposed slavery, and after years of increasing tensions and ineffectual compromise in Congress, both sides erupted into a brutal and bloody civil war. With a decisive Northern victory and the implementation of the 13th Amendment, slavery was officially ended. However, as with most stories from history, the truth is a little bit more complicated. The simplified narrative of Northern abolitionists against Southern slave owners is far too oversimplified, as the history of slavery right here in Wilton exemplifies. I'm Wilton Historical Society Associate Curator Nick Foster, and on this episode of History is Here, we're going to examine the history of slavery in Wilton, as well as in the state of Connecticut as a whole. Connecticut's role in the institution of slavery is probably much larger than people realize, and as recent events have made clear, the impact of slavery across this country is still being felt today. The institution of slavery in Connecticut is almost as old as Connecticut itself. Within 5 years of the establishment of the first English colony in Connecticut in 1633, enslaved Native Americans in the aftermath of the Pequot War were sent to the Caribbean in exchange for enslaved Africans. This trade would remain common practice throughout much of the 17th century. The number of enslaved people imported into the colony grew throughout the 17th and 18th century, as the arrival of more colonists created a greater desire for free labor. By the time of the American Revolution, Connecticut had the largest population of enslaved people in all of New England, with more than 5,000 in 1774. That year, the town of Norwalk, which at that time included Wilton, counted 136 enslaved people, although the 1790 census of Wilton showed only a dozen enslaved people within the parish boundaries. The first enslaved Africans in Wilton arrived in 1734, and some of the town's most prominent families, such as the Comstocks, Lamberts, Keelers, and Middlebrooks, were among those that used the labor of enslaved people. Women were generally tasked with household chores, like cooking and cleaning, while men worked in the fields and barns of the colonial farms. Near the end of the 1700s, attitudes about slavery in the North began to split. Some groups, like the Quakers, viewed slavery as immoral and protested for its abolition. Others felt that the rights of property owners should be the utmost concern and that slavery should continue as it had for over a century. Connecticut authorities, looking to appease both sides, provided a half-hearted solution. In 1784, they introduced the Gradual Abolition Act, which stated that any enslaved person born after March 1st of that year would achieve their freedom once they turned the age of 25. And while this act was the first step towards abolition, it did nothing to provide for the parents still held in bondage. The fight for abolition in Wilton throughout the first half of the 19th century was far from civil. In November 1838, riots broke out when Reverend Nathaniel Kohlberg, a member of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society, was invited to speak at the Georgetown Baptist Church. Over 3 days, Kohlberg preached to his audience on the evils of slavery, while a hostile crowd outside threw rocks and broke windows. At about 2 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, an explosion destroyed much of the building. A barrel of gunpowder had been placed under the pulpit of the church and had been detonated by an unknown pro-slavery terrorist. The Norwalk Gazette newspaper attempted to cast blame on both sides for the bombing by stating, "We are no apologists for the intemperate and fanatic zeal of the abolitionists, and that the church had been profaned by these abolition orgies." The newspaper did renounce the bombings by saying, "Notwithstanding the provocation, and notwithstanding the trifling amount of damage occasioned by this wanton outrage, we most sincerely deprecate the presence of a spirit that does violence." Culver and the Anti-Slavery Society remained undeterred, and echoing a statement by William Lord Garrison claiming Connecticut was the Georgia of the North, Culver went even further, saying Fairfield County specifically was the Georgia of Connecticut. Another bombing occurred a month later at a home on Pimpawag Road, although this time an anti-slavery meeting was in session. No one was killed, but audience members dealt with glass shards from broken windows. Even in the face of such violence, Wilton abolitionists defiantly stood up against the cruelty of slavery. The home of resident William Wakeman at 36 Sealy Road was turned into a stop on the Underground Railroad. Enslaved people who escaped from plantations further south could stop at Wakeman's house for a night to eat and sleep before heading north to the safety of Canada. Wakeman even constructed a tunnel beneath his house as a hiding place. This was a risky proposition for everyone involved, because after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, northern states were required to return escaped slaves to the South and heavily fined anyone who assisted escapees. The efforts of abolitionists of all races paid off, and in 1848, Connecticut officially abolished slavery. Between the previously enacted gradual emancipation laws and public opinion shifts which caused many owners to emancipate their slaves, there are only 17 legally enslaved people in Connecticut at the time of abolition. The last enslaved person in Wilton was Hagar Tonquin. She appeared in the 1830 census as property of the Belden family and had been born in the 1770s before gradual emancipation had been enacted. Very few physical objects that represent the history of slavery in Wilton still remain. One of them is on display here at the Society's Connecticut's History Wilton Story exhibition. It's a 1757 bill of sale for an enslaved African man named Jack. This document helps tell the story of Spruce Bank Cemetery, a burial ground that, as local tradition suggests, is the final resting place of many of the enslaved people of Wilton. Its exact location, somewhere along the west side of Danbury Road, just north of Merwin Meadows, has been lost to history. Even after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery across the nation, the racial prejudices that had justified the horrible institution for so long did not simply disappear. One example of this appears in this Wilton dog register from 1898, where a member of the Comstock family lists the name of her dog as a racial slur. And while not as explicit as the Jim Crow laws of the legally segregated South, other legal practices like redlining or prejudicial housing policies across the country, even right here in Connecticut, continue to affect the lives of the descendants of enslaved people. This video relied heavily on the research of 5 former Wilton High School students: Megan Downey, Eve Mandel, Nina Mellon, Kyle Nash, and Ian Sanders, and the Society sincerely thanks them for their hard work. Their research is a reminder that historical events are rarely simple, with defined beginning and end points and an easily summarized result. In the words of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the past, the present, and the future are all one. They are today. The actions taken today can affect history for decades, even centuries into the future. As always, thanks for watching. Remember that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And stay tuned for more history.